the centre focus on a number of areas, but really they are all kind of tied together by a theme of prosperity. And there's too much of a tendency, I think, to take the prosperity that we have here. In Minnesota, in terms of GDP per capita, is one of the most prosperous places in America, one of the most prosperous places on earth in history. And we take that for granted too much. There are all these plans and proposals out there to take this money and spend this much and divvy this up and spend this much and spend that much. But there's very little thought to where any of this came from. It's all just assumed to be there, like manna from heaven. The point is, wealth does not just materialise. Man's natural state is poverty. And so really what we look at, the big question in economics is not what causes poverty, it's what causes prosperity. For most of history, almost everybody has been poor. The period that we live in now, the place we live in now, is a very special place to live in. And what we do at the centre is we look at all the very many causes there are of that prosperity. And that covers various things. And like I say, that's what ties together our work on education. It's what ties together our work on energy policy. And it's what ties together the economic work that we do. And it ties in things like law and order as well. Because as George Pepper showed in How the West Was Won, if you have no law and order, you won't have prosperity very long, which is a message that the leaders in our cities really should pick up on. What I want to talk to you about today is our new report. You've all got copies of it in front of you there. This is part of our work on how to generate a prosperous state, a prosperous Minnesota. And what you'll see, I'll open with a quote. This is the best place to start. My glamorous assistant, Mike, over there, is changing the slides for me today. This is a quote from Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, who said, "A single courageous state may, if its citizens choose, serve as a laboratory and try novel social and economic experiments without risk to the rest of the country." Now that's exactly what the states in America have done. And as you look across them, you will see a very broad range of economic policies. Economic policies at the state level primarily are taxes and regulation. We don't think about monetary policy because that applies to every state equally. It's governed by the Federal Reserve. It's kind of exogenous to what we're looking at. In that sense, actually analysing a US state economy is a lot like looking at a Eurozone economy. But what you see here, next slide. These are the income and corporate tax rates and brackets given by the Tax Foundation for 2020. They show Minnesota and its neighbours. And you can see here that we have a really kind of nice spread, actually, through the Tax Foundation's rankings. So we have South Dakota, second. That's the second kind of lightest tax burden in the country. North Dakota, 16th, a little bit lower. Wisconsin, 26th, kind of right there in the middle. And we have Iowa, 42nd, that's a bit surprising. And down there, 45th, doing about as badly as the Vikings this year, is Minnesota. But you do see that we're spread quite nicely and quite evenly throughout the 50 states of the Union. So we really are doing what Louis Brandeis said, and conducting these novel social and economic experiments. This slide here, it appears in the report. You can't see it all that well, but what this shows you is income and corporate tax rates and brackets for Minnesota and its neighbouring states for 2010 and 2018. Now, there's a couple of reasons why I do the 2010 to 2018 comparison. The first one is that was the period when Mark Dayton was governor here and Scott Walker was governor the other side of the river. Now, that was a period when people often characterised it as a massive diversion in terms of economic policy, as though this side of the river was, East Germany, and if you crossed the river over there, it was kind of freewheeling capitalism, and everyone was just kind of opening businesses on street corners everywhere you went, and taxes didn't exist. I think our friends from Wisconsin here today will tell you that's not actually the case. It's certainly not the case when you look at Wisconsin's tax ranking. But another reason I chose the 2010 to 2018 period is that we look at the border counties, and we're looking at county level data. Now, national level data comes out first, then state level data, then county level data. And 2018, for some of these things that we look at, is actually the most recent data that was available at the time we did the report. Just a quick summary of the changes that we see there. Over the period, corporate tax rates and brackets in the states remained unchanged, except for in North Dakota, where rates fell. The sales tax rate changed only in South Dakota with a 0.5 percentage point increase. And South Dakota and Iowa saw little or no change in income taxes. Wisconsin and North Dakota both cut them, and Minnesota increased them on the highest earners. So just as we have a good spread through the rankings of the 50 states, we also have a good spread in terms of policy actions over those years. Some rates go up and some rates go down. Now, what can we theorize from this? What can we take from this as a kind of prediction of what could happen? You know, the economic variables that we look at, like job creation, GDP growth, things like that. Well, this is a report. It came out from the Tax Foundation in 2012. It summarizes, it says there, what is the evidence on taxes on growth? The key takeaway is this sentence here. More and more, the consensus among experts is that taxes on corporate and personal income are particularly harmful to economic growth, with consumption and property taxes less so. Now, this report's 2012, obviously it's been a few years since then. We have updated the literature review. It's all footnoted in the report, so you can go and look at it. The findings don't really change this conclusion too much. What's interesting is while you can find some studies that tell you that there is a negative impact of high taxes on growth, you can find some studies that tell you there is no impact of high taxes on growth. What you will not find is a study anywhere that tells you that there is a positive impact from higher taxes on growth. Even the people who support higher taxes will tell you, look, this is negative, there's negative effect. Nobody ever tells you it's a positive. So here we go. This is kind of the main event. This is Minnesota versus Wisconsin. So just to theorize quickly, what we've looked at there is we've got this good spread through Minnesota and its neighbours of tax policy. We've got some changes over the period, 2010 to 2018. And so we can start to think about, well, what would we expect to see? Well, given the literature review, we would expect to see that states which have high tax burdens or have increased their tax burdens would do worse on a range of economic outcomes than states which have which have increased or which have low tax burdens or have lowered them. Now, the reason we look at the border county, I just want to talk about this briefly, is that if you compare states, and this is what's very often done, the Louis Brandeis thing, you look at the economic outcomes in terms of GDP of two states, and people will say, well, the only difference is there because, of course, monetary policy is the same, trade policy is the same, that's all decided at the federal level. The only difference has to be state economic policy. Well, not necessarily. I'll give you two quick examples. One is North Dakota and Minnesota, for example. So North Dakota led the nation in terms of GDP growth over this period, and you would look at that and say, well, that must be down to North Dakota's economic policies. Possibly. But it's also down to the back in oil fields. Now, of course, the decision of whether or not you develop these oil fields is a policy question. As you see in this state, the decision that we've taken not to develop mining resources in the north of the state. These are policy decisions. But whether you have those decisions to make or not, that's a question of geology. That's not policy. A second example is the Twin Cities, which are just down there, and which we are technically in at the moment. The 7-county metro area, the MSA, defined by the Census Bureau as the Twin Cities. We're still in it. And that's basically, it's a huge engine of growth. It's a really positive thing for Minnesota to have the Twin Cities there. The Twin Cities are the 15th largest MSA by GDP in the United States. And there's a mountain of literature, again, we summarize it in the report, it's all footnoted in there, that shows you that for a variety of reasons, having a big city is a really good thing for economic growth. But of course, so you'll look at Minnesota and it will do well than, say, another state, like Iowa perhaps, in terms of GDP growth. But that's because Iowa doesn't have something comparable to the Twin Cities. Wisconsin, which is Minnesota's twin, as people often tell you, does not have an urban area of comparable size to the Twin Cities. Whereas Minnesota has 5 MSAs. I think Wisconsin has something like 13. But there are places like Milwaukee, which are a lot smaller than the Twin Cities. So of course, the growth effects that they have from these kind of concentration are a lot lower. And of course, the Twin Cities, again, having these things there is partly a function of policy, but not entirely. It's not a function of, the Twin Cities aren't this big area because of the Waltz administration or because of the Dayton administration, the Pawlenty or the Ventura administrations. The Twin Cities, Minneapolis, has been one of the biggest cities in America since 1880. So to some extent, to the extent that Minnesota is reaping the rewards in terms of growth from having a large city, it's reaping the rewards from things that were done more than a century ago. That just goes to show, I think, the lesson of how the West was won. And so what we try to do here with this report is to push as many as possible of these factors which can drive outcomes but aren't functions of state policy. We try to push those out by looking at smaller areas, by zooming in. And I got the idea from the book Why Nations Fail by Darren Atchonoglu and James Robinson. It's a very interesting book. You'll find it in a lot of airport bookshops. Pick it up. But without going into that too much, by looking at these smaller areas, we can push a lot of these factors out. And we can really zero in on why it is that economic outcomes differ and the impact of state policies on them. We can't exclude everything. Sorry, that's the right one. Yeah, so we can't exclude everything. Here we have, so here, for example, the border counties of Minnesota and Wisconsin are the most difficult to compare in this sense. Because the river right outside is a fairly sizable border at the margin compared to the borders with Iowa and North Dakota and South Dakota, which are very easily crossed. Also, that means that there's larger policy space for legislators to work in before people think, right, that's enough, I'm moving. Because it raises the cost of moving from one place to another. There's also 3 MSAs along this border. There's La Crosse, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Duluth Superior. Which, to the extent that these things can have these distorting effects, you will see that. So bear that in mind as we have a quick look through now the specifically Minnesota-Wisconsin comparisons. You'll see here that Minnesota and Wisconsin, in terms of the border counties, Minnesota's actually done a better job in recent years, of attracting residents to these border counties. But there are reasons for that. This is a quick summary of the numbers. Between 2010 and 2018, Minnesota's population increased by 4.3% compared to 2.3% in Wisconsin. But again, you're seeing the urban effect there. Just 2 counties, Dakota and Washington County, both in the Twin Cities MSA, account for 98% of that population growth in Minnesota. The 2 Wisconsin counties in that MSA, St. Croix and Pierce, account for just 70% of Wisconsin's. If we remove the 4 counties of the Twin Cities MSA, 2 from each state, then Wisconsin actually sees faster net population growth of 1% compared to 0.2%. That suggests that the population growth is a lot more broadly based on the Wisconsin side of the border than it is here. It's a similar thing if you look at the other MSAs as well. The La Crosse MSA, it's not spread as far, across the river into Houston County in Minnesota. So whereas, Wisconsin counties have benefited from growth in Minnesota, Minnesota counties haven't benefited from growth in Wisconsin. And then if you look at Duluth Superior, both counties there have lost population, although Douglas in Wisconsin has fared slightly worse. Now we look at businesses. This is the percentage change in private establishments, which is a kind of clunky name the BEA uses for businesses. And you'll see there that Wisconsin actually does slightly better with an inflection point from 2014. Before that, it was kind of the same. 2014, something happened that made business grow faster on the Wisconsin side of the border. And I think if you read the report, you'll get some ideas of what those might be. Just a summary of the numbers. The number of businesses in the Wisconsin border counties rose by 11.6% in those 8 years, compared to 4.3% on the Minnesota side of the border. If we look at jobs, in the Minnesota counties, total employment increased by 11.5%, but it was slightly higher in Wisconsin. So whereas business grew faster in Wisconsin, employment grew faster in Minnesota. But you have to think to yourself there, the businesses that we see expanding in the Wisconsin side are the smaller ones. They're the kind of job creators of the future. And so we see more entrepreneurialism there. What we're seeing in Minnesota to some extent is a legacy function of bigger employers. Minnesota's border counties have actually seen a net loss of businesses if we strip out the 2 urban counties. By contrast, on the Wisconsin side of the border, every county has seen business growth. So again, looking at that side of the border, looking out the window there in fact, you are looking at a situation where the growth is a lot more broadly based. This is our final metric, the per capita change in real, the percentage change in real per capita personal income. Not too much gap in this. Minnesota's slightly higher than Wisconsin. Per capita personal income increased by 18.6% in Minnesota and by 15.8% in Wisconsin. And there wasn't really a great change in any of, or much difference in the sources of growth of these. So if we're thinking about what our theory might have been, that states that have lower burdens or have lowered their burdens would do better than states which have raised their burdens or have high burdens, then this perhaps isn't a slam dunk. You look at this and think, well, on some of these measures, Minnesota did better than Wisconsin. Well, let's look at our full sample collection of observations, and that's what you see here with this very garish slide. What you see with this is it shows you the comparisons on all these range of things with Minnesota and its neighbours. And what you see, as we go up, so we got Minnesota 45th, remember, we got to Iowa 42nd. We would expect Iowa to do better than Minnesota, and it does. Minnesota, the green boxes are where Minnesota wins. Minnesota only wins against Iowa on population and the age of the population. It ties in terms of the education of the population, but it loses on all the others. It loses on the two economic measures of business and job creation, and it loses on the quality of life measures of personal income, wages and poverty. If we take one more step up, this brings us back here to Wisconsin, which was 26th, don't forget. Here Minnesota actually wins. The only categories where Minnesota loses is business growth and percentage of the population in poverty. The poverty rate actually fell faster on the Wisconsin side of the border. So the Wisconsin one doesn't quite fit our prediction, like the Iowa one did. So we move one more up to 16th, which is North Dakota. Again, we'd expect to see that beat Minnesota and by more than Iowa, and we do. And so we've got this one here. The only areas where Minnesota scores a win there are on the age of the population and the education levels of the population. On all the other measures, Minnesota loses. And then we go straight up to number 2, which is South Dakota on those rankings. Again, we would expect to see South Dakota do better than Minnesota. We would expect South Dakota to do better than Minnesota more than North Dakota did better than Minnesota. And again, that's exactly what we do see. When we look at South Dakota, the comparisons there, the only measure where Minnesota beats South Dakota is on per capita personal income. And if you read the report, it's an interesting thing because the sources of per capita income growth in those two counties, it comes from 3 sources: wages, capital income like investments, and transfer income, something like social security and welfare. And if you look at that green line there where Minnesota wins against South Dakota, what you're seeing is that growth in Minnesota is driven by transfer payments, whereas in South Dakota the growth is driven by wages. And that's not a good thing for Minnesota because transfer payments, as the name suggests, have to be transferred. Somebody has to earn them before they get transferred. You cannot rely on increased transfer payments as a medium even strategy for increasing incomes. So I think actually overall when we look at this, what we do see, we have the example of Wisconsin that doesn't quite fit, but as I say, that this is the border that's most difficult in terms of our theory because we have the non-porous border and a huge distorting effect of the Twin Cities. Overall, I think that this does show one more piece of evidence that shows that there is a negative impact of heavy taxes on economic growth, and that raising taxes is a bad idea, and that cutting them, especially in Minnesota's position, ranked 45th, will be a good idea. That brings me to the end of my short talk. There will be questions, but that will be after I've handed over to our friends in Wisconsin from the Badger Institute. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. I'm Mike Nichols. I'm the president of the Badger Institute. Love the brogue. My grandparents were from Cary, so we lost the brogue a couple generations ago in our family. At the Badger Institute, we do a lot of the same things that the Center of the American Experiment does, and we've been wanting to start to partner with the Center of the American Experiment here for quite a while, and we're very thankful that we can work with you guys today. And there was a time when I wasn't so happy to be in Minnesota. When I was 18, I didn't want to be in Minnesota. I wanted to go east, right, towards Wisconsin. Actually had a lot to do with the fact that the drinking age in Wisconsin at that time was 18, so that was it. But there are other reasons too. We think that people in Minnesota go east. We like to think we are better in some small ways on some economic issues or tax issues. It wasn't always that way. I think when I first moved to Wisconsin 30 years ago, we considered ourselves a tax hell, and it became worse over time. The pre sort of Walker years, we were kind of a tax hell. And this is when things were reversed back before Walker was governor, and that was Jim Doyle. That's when Phelan was governor here, right? We had a Republican here and a Democrat over there, and of course it later got reversed. So things kind of changed a little bit, honestly, and we're not really the tax hell we once were. You know, we're 26th now, whereas before we were always way up in the 30s. But a couple years ago, we thought, you know, things just still aren't right. The tax levels maybe are down a little bit. Walker did bring down tax levels in Wisconsin. He cut taxes by a couple $1 billion. In Wisconsin, as John said, he was there between 2011 and 19, when same year as Mark Dayton was governor here. And so there were some good things that happened on taxes, but those changes were not systemic. So, and we sort of realize that. We don't have a tax analyst per se at the Badger Institute. We do a lot of other stuff. As is the Center for the American Experiment, we do a lot of, like now, professional licensure, workforce issues. We do some tax issues. We actually are doing some criminal justice issues and a wide variety of things. But we don't have a tax expert per se on staff. So we partnered with the Tax Foundation, who are experts on state-level tax policy and also national tax policy out in D.C. And they came in, and specifically Catherine Lawhead, who's going to join us here in a moment, I hope. She's appearing remotely with us here from D.C. She's an analyst for the Tax Foundation, and she and I and a couple of my colleagues and her colleagues traveled all of Wisconsin, and this is maybe 18 months ago, over the course of maybe 10 months actually. Talked to people about regional differences in taxes and attitudes towards taxes. Catherine and her colleagues did a whole analysis actually of what our tax levels were. And I won't get into all the details because Catherine's going to do it, but suffice it to say that what we have in Wisconsin, and I think it's similar to Minnesota, so this is going to be great for this audience, is a bad tax mix. As John indicated, super high personal income taxes. You'll see that in some slides that Catherine's going to show. And pretty high corporate taxes too, with some huge exemptions. And pretty low sales taxes, which you think would be great, and is in a way, but not a great tax mix. And so I'm hoping we can talk about this a little bit. What the tax experts will tell you, the pro-growth tax experts, is you want a broad-based consumption tax. Not super high destructive is the word John used, and that's accurate. Not super high destructive individual and corporate income taxes, because they are destructive. They're not motivators. They're destructive to income creation and job growth. So we brought the Tax Foundation in, and they did an analysis, and I wish we had more time to tell you what the options are in this book right here. It's called Wisconsin Tax Options. I don't know if any of you guys live in Wisconsin, close enough, but I think this is pretty instructive for Minnesota too, about how we can have a better tax mix. And that's basically, you know, a broader-based consumption tax, bring down those more destructive taxes for a real pro-growth tax structure that benefits everybody. I want to give Catherine 20 minutes to talk, so I'm going to stop. The only thing other thing I'm going to say is that people think maybe this is a bad time for tax reform because, you know, we're going to face a tough year, particularly next year with revenues, given what's going on in the world. Never a bad time for tax reform. Actually, Wisconsin's doing okay in terms of revenues so far, other than our gas tax revenues, and we think there's a remedy for that. There's a better way. We don't think gas taxes are actually the best way to fund transportation needs. We can talk about that later. But we do think that there's some real opportunity for pro-growth tax reform in our state, and probably in Minnesota too, from what I can see, in the years to come. And so I want to introduce my friend, Catherine Lawhead from the Tax Foundation. She's going to talk a little bit more about comparisons between Minnesota and Wisconsin, and I think tell us a little bit more about some policy remedies that can really help us grow. So, Catherine?
Well, thank you so much, Mike, for that kind introduction, and really appreciate the opportunity and the invitation from both your organizations to join you remotely today. Would love to be there in person, but with DC travel restrictions, that's just been really difficult for our organization this year, but really appreciate the invitation to be here remotely. So let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, does that look okay? Can see it okay? All right, well, so I want to just start by giving a little bit of background about the Tax Foundation and what we do. Basically, we are a nonprofit and nonpartisan tax policy research organization, and we've been around for 82 years, working to advance sound tax policy at the state, federal, and recently international levels. And so we believe there's a lot of different ways to raise a dollar of revenue, but some are a lot more harmful to the economy than others. So our primary goal is to help states raise revenue in a way that avoids negatively impacting economic growth and job growth and wage growth in your states. And so it's really great to be with both your organizations. As Mike mentioned, we have spent a lot of time with the Badger Institute over the course of the past couple of years to offer some tax policy solutions specific to Wisconsin. But I will say we're not biased toward any particular state. We want to help all states succeed. And we think that by helping one state succeed, we really hope that that'll help other states around them to succeed too by, as they see each other inching forward toward better tax policy, that fosters good competition, which we think is healthy for all states and for the nation as a whole. And so my main focus today will be talking about how both states can work on improving their tax structure and how that will ultimately help increase investment in your states and improve the economic climate in your states. And so I want to walk you through our State Business Tax Climate Index. What that is a report the Tax Foundation has issued for the past 18 years that ranks states according to tax structure. So it uses 120 different policy variables, and it evaluates state tax structure on each of the major components you see there on the screen, like corporate, individual, sales, property, and unemployment insurance taxes. And when I say we use different policy variables, what I mean by that is we look at things like, does the state have a flat or graduated rate income tax? Are the brackets indexed for inflation? Is there a marriage penalty? Is there an estate tax? Things like that. Because we believe there are better and worse answers to each of those questions from an economic standpoint. And so states that score best on our index are those that adhere pretty closely to the principles of sound tax policy, like simplicity, neutrality, transparency, and stability. And so the goal of the index is to help states learn how they can kind of improve on those things. And so here you see how every state ranked overall on this year's index. And you see Wisconsin's at 25th, so right in the middle of the pack. But unfortunately, Minnesota was ranked only 46th overall, so tied with DC and better than only Connecticut, New York, California, and New Jersey. And so actually a lot of the states in the top 10, which you see there in blue, something that makes a lot of them unique is a lot of them go without one of the major taxes. And several of them are pretty oil-rich states that have a lot of natural resources, so they can rely more heavily on severance taxes and maybe completely forgo an income tax or corporate and individual income or sales or something like that. But it is still possible for some states to levy all the major taxes and still be in the top 10. So states like Utah at number 8, Indiana at number 9, or North Carolina at number 10 are really great states to emulate, especially when you're looking at ways both your states can improve your tax code. We try to encourage a lot of states to emulate those three. And those three states have made a lot of really good reforms over the past decade specifically, and that's why they're ranked so well. But looking specifically at Wisconsin and Minnesota's rates, so Wisconsin is 25th overall, as I mentioned, and Minnesota's 46th, and then you see how they rank on each of the major components, and I kind of color-coded them there so you can see where the state is doing well, and then where it is doing around average, and where it could use improvement. And then the plus 1, 2, and 3s in black there show how those rankings improved from last year. And I will note, though, that neither Wisconsin nor Minnesota made any major tax policy changes that were reflected in this year's, which had a snapshot date of July 1st of this year. And so most of the improvements you see there are due to other states making actually poor tax policy decisions. So for instance, Virginia was ranked 25th and Wisconsin was 25th last year, but they flip-flopped this year because Virginia increased a lot of excise taxes and things like that. And so you see, basically what Wisconsin does really well is sales taxes, in part because it has one of the lowest state sales tax rates in the country, also has a really good sales tax base where it treats the base uniformly at the state and local level, does a good job of adhering to the Supreme Court's guidance on sales tax application to out-of-state sellers in a pretty competitive way that doesn't unduly burden out-of-state sellers. And then actually, probably surprisingly to a lot of Wisconsinites, but the state does rank fairly well on property taxes because it goes without an estate tax, unlike Minnesota, unfortunately, which does have an estate tax. And then Wisconsin also avoids things like capital stock taxes, and it does have a pretty strong uniformity clause, and it treats property more neutrally than other states. And so on the individual side of things, that's where Wisconsin probably needs some of the most improvement because of the high rates, many brackets, a marriage penalty, things like that. And then for Minnesota, you see kind of where it's around average on sales, property, and UI taxes. But why it ranks so poorly on corporate and individual taxes is because of uniquely high top rates on both those taxes. The state also levies both corporate and individual alternative minimum taxes, where it's basically a whole separate tax system that requires taxpayers to calculate their liability twice and then pay the higher amount. So that's harmful policy. So things like that are kind of working against Minnesota on the index and in terms of competitiveness. And so for both those states, it's important to kind of look at those things as some of the top areas to prioritize for reform. And so specifically, I just want to point out a few things that this could mean for competition along the Wisconsin-Minnesota border. So let's say a taxpayer knows they want to be in the Midwest or in the northern US, and maybe they're deciding between both states. There may not be an obvious choice, but taxpayers will look at certain things that matter to them. So for instance, if you are maybe a retired taxpayer toward that end of your life and you're looking at passing down an estate to the next generation or a small business that's been in the family, there's a good reason you'd want to be in Wisconsin over Minnesota because of that estate tax. And now someone who lives in Minnesota, but maybe along the border, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a fair amount of taxpayers that kind of travel across state lines to make larger taxable purchases to take advantage of the lower sales tax rates across the border. However, maybe you're a Minnesotan, but you work in Wisconsin, but you choose to live in Minnesota because property tax rates tend to be lower there. So there's a lot of cross-border competition that's got to be happening even just within those two states to keep in mind. But one thing I want both states to keep in mind is the fact that Iowa, which has historically not been a very competitive tax state, is actually starting to make a lot of good improvements. Iowa enacted really pro-growth tax reform in 2018, and some of those changes have already taken effect, and that actually improved Iowa's ranking on this year's index from 45th, so they were just one step ahead of Minnesota, and now they're 40th overall. And so some of the changes that already took effect and were reflected on the index are better treatment of small business machinery and equipment investments, and better treatment of business interest expenses, and then fully removing international income or GILTI from the tax base. And so things like that have already taken effect, but more good reforms are coming starting actually January 1st of next year. The corporate rate will drop from 12 to 9.8%, matching Minnesota's, which I'm sure was no coincidence at all. I'm sure there was a very good reason they chose 9.8%. And then also the top individual income tax rate is set to drop to 6.5% in January 2023. So Iowa's working on making some good improvements, and that's going to make things more competitive in the region. So now, a couple of things I want to briefly mention that I think both states can work on improving that I've already alluded to, but number one, that corporate income tax rate. So this map on the screen shows the top marginal corporate income tax rates in every state, because some states actually have graduated rate corporate income taxes. Minnesota and Wisconsin both have flat taxes, but basically that's the top rate in every state there. And so you see that Minnesota's is the 4th highest and Wisconsin's is the 15th highest top marginal rate. And they are kind of both in a cluster of really high corporate tax states, with Iowa and Illinois also being high rate taxes, Iowa getting a little lower, Illinois potentially getting a little higher, depending on what happens next week with the ballot measure. But you see, if you look at all of the states in the contiguous US, states kind of along the Mississippi or west of the Mississippi, really there's only California and Louisiana that have higher top rates than kind of the cluster of states in the top. And then there are, of course, higher corporate rate states in the Northeast US, which is, of course, notorious for being a high tax region. But really, there's some states over there that have lower rates than both Minnesota and Wisconsin. New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, they all have lower top rates. So something to work to kind of reduce moving forward. And kind of in the same breath that I say that it's important to work on reducing the corporate rate, I do want to say that one good way to try to do that is to reduce reliance on business incentives. So tax breaks that are available to some businesses, but not others. They really are more of just a Band-Aid for an otherwise uncompetitive tax code. And a lot of states do levy them, so Wisconsin and Minnesota are not unique in this. But there's a lot of evidence out there that most incentives merely subsidize investment that would be occurring anyway, but they do so while making the tax code a lot more complex. I bet there's a number of businesses that maybe won't qualify for the incentives they normally would get this year because maybe they had to lay off a lot of employees or kind of cut back on investments they otherwise planned to make. And so it adds a lot of uncertainty to the tax code, and a better use of that money would be to bring down that top rate. So we really do encourage states to kind of reevaluate some of their incentives from time to time and think about which ones might not be meeting the objectives that they were set out to accomplish. And then another priority for both states, of course, is to reduce the top individual income tax rate specifically. And this map is just like the other one, but showing top marginal individual income tax rates, where you see Minnesota has the 5th highest, Wisconsin has the 10th highest. And so this, of course, matters to a lot of families and individuals, but also to a lot of small businesses that are structured as pass-throughs. So sole proprietorships, partnerships, LLCs, S-corps, they're all paying individual income taxes rather than corporate income taxes. And so these top rates really matter to them, and they can really impact in-state investment. And so here, quickly looking kind of at how both states' rate structures compare. Both states have 4 brackets. Both states have pretty high top marginal rates. And both states actually have a marriage penalty, where the bracket widths for married couples are not quite double what they are for single filers. So in a lot of instances, that can result in married taxpayers having a higher effective tax rate than they would if they filed separately as 2 single individuals. And that's just not good tax policy. A lot of states completely avoid it, so that's something to consider if either state works on kind of adjusting those brackets moving forward. And then the last thing I want to mention is just something that Mike kind of mentioned earlier about the proposals we set forth for Wisconsin and we worked with the Badger Institute on, but one of the keys to tax reform in almost every state is to work on modernizing that sales tax base. Right now, the sales tax applies to most goods with some major exceptions, especially in Minnesota where things like even clothes aren't subject to the sales tax. But there's a lot of goods that are subject to the sales tax, but services by and large are not yet taxed under the sales tax. And really that's just pretty much a historic accident. A lot of sales taxes were created in the 1930s when the economy was a lot more goods-oriented than services-oriented. But you can see how over time, goods have shrunk as a share of personal consumption and services have grown. But the tax base has kind of eroded over time because those services are not being taxed. And so broadening the sales tax base to additional consumer goods and services would generate more state and local revenue, but we're not suggesting states just pocket that revenue. We'd want to use that new revenue to pay for rate reductions to more economically harmful taxes. So corporate and individual income taxes should be some of the first to reduce rates on. So that's kind of the main points I wanted to get across today. I think we have about 15 minutes for questions or so for all three of us, so I will look forward to answering any questions then.
If anybody has anything they want to ask, either me or Catherine or any of the others.
You mentioned on the comparisons the importance of metropolitan areas as economic drivers. We have seen recently two major impacts that had devastating consequences for the metro areas. First, of course, the very strong lockdowns and shutdowns of businesses because of the pandemic, but also because of the destruction from riots, both along Lake Street and in downtown Minneapolis and over in Milwaukee and places like Wauwatosa. Do you have any policy suggestions that you can make as to the importance of, particularly with dealing with the destroyed businesses, getting those areas back up to speed? Historically, it looks like it takes a long time for that to happen. So, number one, any policy suggestions? And number two, do you see any prospects that will happen?
Well, if we look at the Twin Cities in particular, I'll take the two things. Firstly, the thing about lockdowns. I would like to make a point that I think lockdowns are largely a myth. When we talk about lockdowns, what we mean, very largely, is that middle class and rich people stayed home while poor people brought them stuff. And that, I mean, the people who work at Walmart, the people who work at Target, the people who work at Amazon, they weren't on lockdown. They were out there doing what they had, working from home, posting selfies of themselves on Instagram and showing what a great person they were. I've got not too much respect for that. I think that comes across. And so, when we talk about these lockdowns and whatnot, we talked about, I think Mike mentioned tax revenue in Wisconsin wasn't down by so much as you might have expected. The same thing is true here, and the same thing is true in states across America. People have seen GDP tank in the second quarter, and they thought, state budgets are going to be absolutely ruined. Now, of course, it's tough, but we're in a hole that's nowhere near the size that we were expected to be in a few months ago. And the reason for that is here, and I imagine it's the same actually, I was talking to a guy from Iowa about this, and it's certainly the case there. I imagine it's the case in Wisconsin. If you look at the job losses that there were as a result of the lockdowns, they were mostly in lower income jobs. If you're someone who, if most middle class or upper class jobs you can do from home, but most lower paid jobs you have to go somewhere. They're kind of service jobs, they're face-to-face jobs. And so what you see actually, and there's a chart that shows this, I put it on our website before, and you see that employment for the top earners has kind of chunked along, a bit of a dip, but we're actually, employment levels for the top earners are above what they were at the start of the year now. If you look at the people who earn the lowest, you see that there's this big dip and it hasn't come all the way back. Now, if you think that most state revenue comes from income taxes, and that most income taxes will be paid by higher earners, what you're seeing there is that you will not see a proportional drop in tax revenue from a particular drop in employment. So you can see an awful lot of lower wage earners lose their jobs before you start to see massive hits to state income tax revenue. So I think that explains part of what we're seeing actually in terms of the revenues not getting smashed as they are. In terms of law and order, you're absolutely right. And one of the problems that you have there, if you're a guy on Lake Street, who's just there's a particular guy actually, he was written about in the New York Times. He arrived in this country as a refugee from Iraq in 2006. The guy's worked his fingers to the bone building up a business. He's exactly the sort of person this country wants. He's exactly the kind of person who built this country. in a large degree, and yet here he is now, and his business is in ruins. His business has been trashed by, in a lot of cases, white vandals. One of the strange things about what you saw in the Twin Cities, it was almost like a kind of reverse race riot. You saw heavily immigrant areas and heavily ethnic minority areas that were targeted by largely white rioters in the name of social justice. It's absolutely insane. I can't believe, that we've actually gone through this. And I think that going forwards, one thing that we need to see is there does need to be a stronger stance on law and order, because you're not going to rebuild your business after seeing it go up in flames once. You're not going to rebuild your business if you know that the next time this all kicks off, it's going to take 4 days of arguing and umming and ahhing before the National Guard turn up, because the mayor and the governor can't decide between them what they want to do. And that's the thing. There was a report that was done on this. We've done research on this. It was the Senate committee. They did a report on this as well about the riots. This thing could have been snuffed out on the first night if they committed the National Guard. John Jensen, the National Guard commander, said that. Instead, they did it for 4 days, and it was the poor people in places like Lake Street who paid the penalty. So in terms of policy, what they need to do is they need to decide, to actually protect people's property, because without that, you're not going to rebuild. And in terms of the lockdowns and COVID policy, COVID's an interesting disease. It's not like the pandemic of Spanish flu in 1918, which was kind of like an equal opportunities killer. It killed people. The median age of death was a lot lower. The median age of death of COVID-19 is very high. 74% of Minnesota's deaths have come in the state's care homes, which is a population that's largely locked down anyway all the time, by definition. And so actually COVID-19, it's like a kind of precision-guided bomb designed to take out a particular cohort of the population, elderly people with comorbidities who live in care homes. So it seems obvious to me that shutting down First Avenue is not going to help that. Shutting down, the guy who sells hockey equipment in the strip mall is not going to help that. What you've got to do is focus the solutions on where the problem is, and that lies in the state's care homes, and that the state authorities have utterly failed to do, so they need to fix that. I'll pass it over to you.
I will
long answer to a short question.
No, I just piggyback very, very briefly. If you want some evidence that sort of top-down monolithic lockdown policies are very destructive and don't work, we had a paper that was done early on. I think it came out in April by an economist who's a visiting fellow with us. His name's Andrew Hansen, and it was an estimate of the loss of GDP at the county level throughout Wisconsin by what was then Governor Evers' Safe Red Home order. Now, that order was later rescinded because of an order of the Supreme Court, but at the time it existed, and what it showed is that, as John referenced, some of these lockdowns are much more harmful, for instance, in sort of northern counties where you have a population of folks who have to be out working. They can't work at home. Very destructive on a percentage basis to the economy in those places where at that time, and still largely, not a lot of COVID cases or deaths. Now, if you look at a place like Dane County, the seat of government, where a lot more people can work at home because it's a more affluent, well-educated population, and where it's government, so everybody's still working, not as destructive, and that's where the decisions were being made on lockdowns. So just to kind of parrot what John was saying, we think decisions should be made locally and by individuals.
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
Kind of a school question here. I still have a kid in high school, so he's missed almost months of school now where they're doing distance learning. Have you guys done any impact studies or looked at how this is going to affect him in terms of his future earnings potential if he misses a whole year of school, basically?
Well, one of the things that we've looked at, I've written about this on the website, I did write something for a newspaper as well, is that there's an awful lot of research on what happens when you graduate into a recession. And what you see is that you are more likely not only to earn less over the course of your life, you're less likely to be employed. You're also less likely to suffer family breakdown. You're more likely, to suffer family breakdown. You're more likely to suffer substance abuse issues. You're more likely to die young. You're more likely to end up in jail if you graduate into a recession. Now, we've had a really good quarter of economic growth in the third quarter, but we're still nowhere near where we should be, and we've still got unemployment that's incredibly high. And so there's a real dangerous situation. And one of the things about economics is very largely about trade-offs. You know, that if you do this, you don't do that. And the things that you don't do, we call opportunity costs. And that's really where the phrase, there's no such thing as a free lunch comes from. And there is no free lunch here. You can't just keep locking the economy down, open it up, lock it down again. You know, have kids going into school, coming out of school, have businesses laying people on, laying people off again. And you can't do that indefinitely without some massive costs at the end of it. And what we've decided to do, we could be the first generation that's decided to sacrifice their children for themselves, which I think is incredible. Throughout history, it was always the other way around. But not anymore. And I think that in years to come, these opportunity costs I talk about, we've not even begun to fathom exactly what they are. And I don't think that history is going to look too kindly on us. Mike?
No, we haven't. We will, I hope, at some point, Tim. It's a great question. We're very worried about the disparities that already exist between poor kids in Milwaukee, for instance, who are stuck in public schools. They don't have choice. They don't have charter. We're just worried that they're going to fall further and further behind. So at some point, I don't know if it's a year down the road or 5 years down the road when you can really, or 10 years or 20 years down the road when you can really do analysis to show how much they're losing. But we're very, very worried about it, but we haven't, you know, it's not, I don't think it's been ripe for study yet for us.
There is actually, there's a very good website, the COVID Tracking Project or something, and they actually track the amount of schooling that people are having by the income of their parents. And if you're a higher income parent, your kids' schooling has fallen over the course of all this, but not by too much. Where it's really tanked and kids have essentially had for months now no schooling is the lowest earning groups of the population. So again, it ties into this whole thing that this is incredibly economically regressive. And the people who bang the drum most for their kind of compassion and progressivism, you know, are the people who are most in favour of these kind of wacky, horrible, regressive policies. It's absolutely nuts. Whatever disparities there were going into this are going to be far worse coming out of this, and that's only partially going to be down to the disease, which is a very real thing. But it's only partially down to that. It's also in part going to be down to the ridiculous decisions that we've made. We are going to have to wrap up now. We're coming up on 2 o'clock. I'm going to call my colleague Charlie Nichols up to say a few words. I'd like to thank you all for coming along today. I'd like to thank our friends from the Badger Institute for coming over from Wisconsin. Perhaps they'll take Kirk Cousins back with them. We can but hope. But thank you very much, and I'll hand you over to Charlie.
Many thanks to all 3 of you. This is a great session. This is very fast. My point is just, well, I guess 2 points. One is, since the Badgers have owned the Gophers for most of the last decade, and the Packers have owned the Vikings for most of the last decade, fortunately, Minnesotans should be happy we're not establishing policy based on those wins and losses. But the research that you saw the 3 of them present here today is, you can imagine, it takes a lot of analysis of a lot of research, and it takes smart analysis of a lot of research to boil it down and be able to present it in such a cogent, straightforward way today. So we're very grateful to each of you and to the organizations. Speaking on behalf of the center, and most of you are here because you're on our mailing list, my encouragement to you is it's okay if you want to send us a check that has a couple extra zeros in it. There's no rule against that. Your taxes are going to be the same either way. But apart from that, we just want to thank you all for being here, and we look forward to getting out and doing much more of this when these unfortunate lockdowns can be put behind us. So thank you all. Great rest of the day.
Thank you very much. You can go to our website too, which is badgerinstitute.org, for more information on anything we talked about. We appreciate the partnership with you guys. Thank you for listening.